In this video, we're going to do a comprehensive rundown of the Psi-Freak class. We're going to go through the perks, we're going to go through what breeds to use, as well as what Psi powers and mutations work, if it's viable for hard in the long run, how it stacks up against other builds so far. Basically, all the questions that you wanted to know about the Psi-Freak, I'm going to attempt to answer them all in this video. Starting off with the basics here, in terms of breed, the breed you're going to want to pick for this class is FIP. This gives you the most energy power, and energy regen power affects your damage. Energy is how much you can cast spells, and energy regen is how quickly it returns once you stop casting. So this is the best breed for this class. So if you want to play a Psi-Freak and you're min-maxing, then you're going to select this breed. The obvious class choice is, of course, Psi-Freak. You get Spark Ball with this, which is unique to this class, and Mega Mind, which gives you 20% key regeneration, which you basically need because you are going to be flinging spells very, very often, so you need to regen quickly. What's really interesting, though, is that Spark Ball is, although unique to this class, if you don't play a Psi-Freak, you actually get like a fire version instead of a lightning version of this same spell. You don't get access to these passives and obviously the beginning stats. So there's probably no reason to play any, other class if you're going to play this sort of build, and I'll get into why that might be. The Psi-Freak is the only class that actually directly increases Psi power damage by 10% with Psi Spikes. It increases your intellect by 10 at night, further boosting your damage by a little bit. It's the only class that gives you plus 20% key regeneration besides the Mercenary, and that's a paid class or a pre-order bonus. So if you don't have access to that, this is the only way to get that, and you need that desperately for casting. And you also regenerate health based on power damage done with Brain Drain, which makes you just the tankiest class in the game. The Psi-Freak is hands down the tankiest class in the game once you have this passive, because you can just sit there and take hits and regenerate health by returning fire with spells. Now, the really weird thing here is that Mind Melt is a perk that's supposed to give you 10% chance to critically hit with Psi powers. I don't know if that means that, you're supposed to be able to crit 10%, that's the most, or if it's going to give you an extra 10% critical chance. But what I have found so far testing all the Psi powers in the game and all the biogenetics, none crit, ever. No matter what your crit chance is, no matter whether you have this perk, none have ever crit for me, not even one time. So I don't know if this is working as intended, but that Mind Melt perk is either not working as intended or spells aren't working as intended currently, and I don't know which it is. But currently speaking, critical hit plays no role in a Psi-Freak build. So if you're planning to play a Psi-Freak or a caster, you just completely ignore critical chance unless you're going to be using, melee or guns on the side. Now, talking about attributes for a bit with this class, like how you want to put your attribute spread, as I mentioned, critical chance doesn't really play a role in spell casting. So luck isn't going to be something that you really want to invest points into. It might be good if you're going to, use guns or swords or clubs or whatever, but I feel like the damage of Psi powers in all my testing is such that if you don't just pump intellect to hell, you will fall behind in your damage very, very quickly. So the way I built mine is I just pump intellect the whole way, and it was able to finally get over the hump maybe by around level 15, level 20, where I started to feel like I was catching up a little bit maybe to melee and ranged. I have not noticed any stat cap or soft stat caps in this game. It feels very linear in my opinion. Seems like each spell has a multiplier that it multiplies by your intellect modifier somehow to calculate the damage increase. It seems to be about the same every single level. I've tested it multiple levels in a row, and it seems to go by about the same amount, and I've never seen a cap yet. Now, if at some point they fix this and critical hits do apply to spells, it's definitely going to boost the damage of the Psi-Freak class. I'm expecting that to happen, because why would you have a perk to inflict critical hits if you weren't planning to have critical hits with spell casting? So I'm expecting that to happen, but if and when that does happen, I still feel like intellect is really the way to go, because I have not found any other way besides intellect and the perks of the Psi-Freak class to boost your damage. I have not found any stat on armor that boosts power. So if there is one, it's not very, very common at all. I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of armors in the game. There may be one out there somewhere that boosts your power, but I don't think it's reliable to count on it because I just have never seen one. Because you can get critical chance on armor and weapons, essentially what you're saying is I'm going to deal way more damage per spell and I'll crit less often, but when I do, it'll hit really hard, versus all my attacks are going to crit, but they're going to be drastically, drastically weaker. Because you could still probably hit, I'm guesstimating here, somewhere between 40 to 50% crit chance, even without ever boosting luck in this game because of equipment. So if you have 40 or 50% crit chance and your damage is way higher per spell, I feel like that's going to be more optimal than if you went fully crit. And of course, this is all based on the fact that if crit worked how the way it should, or possibly should, for Psi-Freak, which it currently doesn't. So right now, your best bet is intellect anyway, and if they ever change it, you should probably be fine. You probably just look at your gear a little bit differently and shift a little more towards critical chance. Another thing that can be kind of difficult about playing a Psi-Freak or a casting type build in this game is that the general perks don't really benefit you a ton. There are some perks you can take that help, but generally speaking, most of them revolve around combat. For instance, there's one that increases ranged weapon damage. There's one that increased unarmed damage. There's one that increased melee damage, but there are none that increase Psi Power damage. There's none, there's some that reduce reload time. And there's some that make it so that ranged weapons can fire more before reloaded. But there's basically nothing that, really, really helps a Psi Mage build. The ones I do suggest taking here are Perfect Reload, because you will have to fire with your weapon sometimes, particularly early on in the game before you've acquired some of the spells and mutations, etc. I feel like this just benefits you while you're waiting for your energy to come back. You can fire away with your gun. And unless you want to play pure mage and then just like not cast while your energy is, or do anything while your energy is recharging, you could. But I do feel like supplementing that downtime with some sort of ranged weapon seems to work best for me. So Perfect Reload would be probably one of the first things I would pick up. Another one, Key Energized. If you're going to sort of try and play a melee build with, casting, this one is good because you tend to be able to get energy back really quickly with this sort of perk, because it basically gives you 20% of your ki back when you perform a special attack. This happens very frequently in melee combat. Another one that's really good here is Adrenaline, which increases your health regen in combat by 40%. This just helps you regen slowly health in combat, which is great. You don't really need it because this class is tanky as hell, but between this and the perk at the end of your, actual perk tree for the Psi-Freak class, you're going to be very, very tanky in combat. Before I get into the actual abilities and spells themselves, there's one thing I want to discuss, which is hybrid builds. I mentioned it a second ago, but people have been asking me, can you play a melee build and a casting build hybrid? Can you play a ranged build and a casting build hybrid? If you're actually trying to go for like split 50-50, or somewhere in that area, and not just play like really heavily one way or the other, it's going to be very difficult. And the reason for that is that without cranking intellect up every single level, your damage as a Psi-Freak just sorts of falls behind eventually. Your guns are going to outperform your Psi-Freak powers at some point if you don't keep cranking intellect, at which point you'll probably stop using them and you'll wish you just had gone pure range. That's the deal with range. Similar situation with melee. Your melee will simply outperform your Psi-Freak powers unless you crank intellect, at which point you'll wish you'd just gone full strength and gone pure melee. However, if you do want to play a hybrid build, what I would recommend doing is playing the Psi-Freak class and then just taking general perks that buff that sort of style play, either melee or range damage, while continuing to increase your intellect. That way your spells are still powerful, and you should still deal relatively good melee or range damage, because besides a couple of perks in the game, there isn't really anything that boosts your range or melee damage so high that it can't compete without those perks. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the setup that I have found to work the best for a Psi-Freak build or a Mage build in this game. And there are really 4 abilities that you use for a big chunk of the game, probably maybe the first 10 to 15 hours-ish. And these work really well, in my opinion, in combination. That just gets better and better over time. And that is, you want to use Sparkball, Blaze, Radwisps, and Mothmouth. So Sparkball is kind of your bread and butter as the Psi-Freak. It's the one that's unique to you, and you're just going to spam the hell out of this ability. It does decent damage. One really cool thing about this ability is that if you actually hold the button you map it to, it'll sort of charge up. You'll hold it over your head, and you'll fling it, and it'll do an AoE. You don't tend to do this very often, because if you get hit while you do this, it sort of resets it. So it's not something you can use, but if you need AoE and enemies are balled up together, it's a good way to get some AoE. Blaze is your mobility skill. Blaze allows you to get far away from where you are, allows you to dodge further than where you're going, and its damage is super negligible. By basically the middle of the game or early middle of the game and late game, one bullet will outperform the amount of damage Blaze will do 99% of the time. It's that weak in terms of a damaging ability, but it does give you very good mobility, and it's not super expensive. Radwisps is actually a mutation or a biogenetic. It's not a spell, and it does scale with intellect. I've done testing on this. It seems like the mutations or biogenetics do scale with your intellect ability, or attribute rather. So if you were wondering about that, yes, it does apply to these abilities. And what I like about the Radwisp ability is it's kind of machine gunning these wisps around while you move around that are just targeting enemies and softening them up. Why I like it better is it allows me more mobility and more reaction time, because I'm playing on a controller. So if you're holding down left trigger to continuously spam, whatever button you have mapped to Sparkball, and you're moving around the map constantly holding down left trigger, and you go to dodge or something, you can't dodge while your left trigger is held down, and it just gives you less mobility. But while this is going on, things are flying everywhere. You can, be a little bit more mobile. You have a little bit better reaction time because you're not sitting there holding a trigger down. A couple of things about this ability. First of all, if you attack, if you dodge roll, it will end the ability. Or if you take damage, it will end the ability. So you have to try not to get hit, you have to try not to dodge roll, and you have to try not to attack with your melee or with your ranged weapons when this is out. What's really good about it, though, is that if you use Blaze to, avoid something instead of dodge rolling, it doesn't interrupt this thing. So use Blaze to move around while this thing just keeps chunking out wisps at enemies. And you can also spam Spark Ball while this is going on. So, if you got one really tough enemy and the thing is just ticking away at him a little bit, start spamming that Spark Ball too. And, really jam it in there and get the damage in there with the wisps and the Spark Ball at the same time. And that will really boost your DPS. The fourth ability you use is kind of up to you. I like to use Moth Mouth, but you can use whatever you want here. You basically only need those 3 abilities until you get some of the more powerful spells later on. But Moth Mouth basically does like some damage to some enemies. It makes it so like a couple enemies will attack each other very briefly. It's not super strong, but because you have these other abilities that you're just going to be using constantly over and over, you need something in there, and it's one of the things I feel like works the best. But you can really use whatever you want for that fourth ability. One thing I really want to note here too is that when you're playing a Psi-Freak or a Mage build, you want to try to avoid draining all of your energy at one go. Because if you drain like past your bar, it actually takes longer to regenerate than if you stop a little bit short. So try to like cancel out your rad wisps or whatever you're doing, stop casting, and start firing or attacking to end your rad wisps in order to, regenerate your energy faster, because it's going to save you about 3 or 4 seconds of regeneration time so you can get back to casting faster. So discussing some of the more powerful spells here, Levitate, Telekinesis, Key Spark, and Sky Spark. You can have all of these at the same time. You can actually gain Light and Dark Aura at the same time, so you can unlock all the spells and have them all if you want. That's not a problem. So put that out of your head. Just plan to, gain some Dark Points or Light Points in order to gain these. Really, the best way to do this is by deciding what to do with prisoners, which coincidentally give you Psi Points as well, so that's a good quest to do. Go, free all these prisoners will give you Psi Points, and will also give you Light or Dark Aura depending on what you tend to do with them. Or finding animals, capturing them with your net, and saving them or killing them will give you Light or Dark Points as well. Another really good way to gain aura if you're trying to unlock spells. Before I get into these, though, just a quick note about the Blink and Freeze spells. So Blink just costs way too much energy. It's so much energy that you can use it about twice early game before you're completely out of energy, leaving you none to cast spells. So if you're playing a Psi-Freak, you're not going to use this. In fact, you'd probably use this if you were playing something like a melee build to get in range or something like that, maybe. Freeze just deals abysmal damage. To give you some idea, it roughly deals 20% more damage than Spark Ball in an AoE, but costs like 5 times more. So you could essentially charge a Spark Ball and get more damage, and it would cost you 5 times less energy. It's just really bad on energy management, which is why I don't use either of those 2 abilities. So talking about Levitate first, this will put you about 10 to 15 feet up into the air, and you'll just float while your energy sort of gradually depletes. It seems to deplete slower than Rad Wisps a little bit, and you can actually sit up there, float in the air, and use Rad Wisps and Spark Ball while you're floating with Telekinesis too if you want to feel like a demigod or something. But your energy will drain markedly faster if you do this, and you won't be able to do it for very long. I actually really don't see much benefit to using Levitate if you're playing a Psi-Freak class, because it just drains your energy and you don't really need to float up in the air. You need your energy. I actually use the most benefit if you're playing a ranged build. So you can use your energy to just sit up there and float in the air while your ranged enemies down and the melee units can't get to you. I feel like that's probably the best use of this. So you're really not going to use this much if you're playing a Psi-Freak build, other than if you just want to look cool. In terms of Telekinesis, this ability will pick up small enemies and fling them. You can fling them into each other, fling them into large enemies to deal damage to both targets. Or you can pick up objects and fling them. It seems to be very, very sporadic in terms of the effectiveness. For instance, if you try and use it on big enemies, it does nothing but picks up a rock from the ground and throws it at them. This rock does no damage 99% of the time. I don't know why. I imagine it's supposed to do damage. Also, if you pick up like barrels or something and throw them, they do no damage. If you pick up exploding barrels at like level 20 something, they deal 200 damage, which is like, I don't know, a fifth of your Spark Ball at that point. So Telekinesis just isn't worth it, in my opinion. It's not very effective. The only thing that would be really good for is if you're near like an oil pit, or maybe you're near water, you could pick up enemies and fling them out into the water or the oil, and they would die. Like, that's about it. It's very, very situational at best. I don't recommend it. It doesn't seem to be super effective for the cost. Moving along to Key Spark, this is probably the pound per pound DPS king of all spells in the game. The downside is that you have to be rather close to enemies, and it is a channel. that will be interrupted if you take damage. So if you're standing there next to 5 enemies using it, and one's trying to melee you and 2 are shooting at you, it's going to be kind of hard to maintain. But what's really great about it is because you can gain health back from your last perk, 20% damage is returned as health to you. You basically become a god when you have this spell. You can sit there like 5 feet from the enemy while they're wailing on you, and even if you get interrupted, you just use it again, and you heal all the way back up, and then if you get interrupted, you spam it again. It kind of trivializes combat for the Psi-Freak class, because all you do at that point really is just use that spell in a lot of cases. It's not every case. Maybe some boss fights you won't. But for regular combat encounters, you can just literally sit there and hold it, and it'll just chain between enemies and heal you for tons of health while you deal pretty decent damage. Another thing that makes this spell particularly deadly as well is that you can cast other spells while it's channeling, like Spark Ball or Sky Spark. So you can sit there and electrify enemies and then like drop a nuke on their head or chuck balls of lightning into them and still deal more damage that way. Lastly, we have Sky Spark. This is the most damage you can deal in one burst. It's basically going to let you like move a target, and it's going to drop a huge AoE on that area, and it's going to knock enemies down and backward when it lands. So I think at about the level that I got to with Psi-Freak, which is around 22 or 23, it takes you about probably 4 to 6 of these to kill a pack of enemies, which isn't a ton, but the downside is there's about a 5-second cooldown before you can use it again. The best way to actually use this spell is to use it while you're channeling Ki Spark, so you get up close to the enemies, you start channeling, and then drop this as like a nuke, kind of knocks them down, and you just keep moving into them with Ki Spark, dropping this as necessary. That way you're not doing nothing in between these spells, and you're dealing damage the whole way. So obviously, once you either get Ki Spark or Sky Spark, I recommend swapping out Moth Mouth for something else. I do like the other abilities still, so I would either go Ki Spark or Sky Spark, whichever you like more, because you can still use, like for instance, you can actually use Rad Wisps while you're using Ki Spark if you want to deal even more damage, but your energy will drain super fast if you do this, which is why it's important to have a lot of energy. So that's basically how the Psi-Free works. It does catch up to ranged and melee builds later in the game, most notably because of the Ki Spark power and Sky Spark. But it takes you quite a while to get them, and in fact, if you don't know where to go, like if it's your first playthrough, and you don't just follow this quest chain along for a good 5 hours to get all these points, and you don't know where all the Psi points are, it's going to take you a lot longer for this build to come together, so it has a much, much slower start than those types of builds. Again, I feel like the real tragedy here is there's just no way to boost damage with equipment, whereas ranged and melee both have this option. You can get stronger weapons, you can mod these, you can get things that boost your damage there, and there are general perks that do this. There's nothing like that for Psi Powers outside of the Psi-Freak class itself, which is kind of a disappointment. We're going to have other videos for the Deadeye build that we have, which is the most powerful build in the game, and a mercenary build as well, or a melee build explaining how to play melee well. I have a fairly good idea of this. I'm not quite high enough to make 100% conclusions about things, but I'm getting very, very close, so look for that build as well soon. Also, if you have questions about the game, be sure to check out the official wiki or drop by our stream. We're going to be live streaming this pretty much all week. By the time this video goes live, we'll likely be live on Twitch with Biomutant. So if you have questions, you want to get something clarified, or you want more information about the game, feel free to drop by and I will answer any question I can.